In the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, Nazi Germany seemed unstoppable. Adolf Hitler approved preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the ambitious plan to invade Great Britain and force an end to the war in the West. However, that invasion never took place. British resistance, German air failures during the Battle of Britain, logistical limitations, and Hitler's own strategic doubts transformed what should have been a decisive blow into a missed opportunity. Understanding why Berlin abandoned this plan is key to understanding the Third Reich's first major setback. Why did Nazi Germany abandon its plan to invade Great Britain? After the fall of France in June 1940, Europe was plunged into an unprecedented situation. In just 6 weeks, the German army had defeated one of the continent's major military powers, humiliating a country with a vast colonial empire, a centuries-old military tradition, and one of the largest armies in the world. The speed of the victory not only surprised the Allies, but also profoundly altered Germany's perception of itself and the future course of the war. For Adolf Hitler, the French defeat confirmed that his strategy had been correct. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, seemed invincible. Poland had fallen in weeks, Denmark and Norway had been neutralized, the Netherlands and Belgium had barely resisted, and France, considered for decades Germany's main continental rival, had collapsed with humiliating speed. From Berlin, the Reich seemed unstoppable. The Third Reich now dominated Western Europe from the Atlantic to the Soviet border. However, this victory created an immediate strategic problem. For the first time since the start of the war, Germany had no direct continental enemy. Only one remained, isolated but challenging: the United Kingdom. Great Britain found itself in a paradoxical position. It had suffered a devastating political and military defeat with the fall of its main European ally, but it was not defeated. The British Army had managed to evacuate more than 330,000 men in the Dunkirk operation, losing almost all of its heavy equipment, but retaining the core of its armed forces. The Royal Navy remained intact and dominated the seas. And, perhaps more importantly, the United Kingdom had not been invaded or defeated on its own territory. Winston Churchill's rise to power in May 1940 marked a psychological turning point. Unlike other European leaders who had sought a settlement with Germany, Churchill made it clear that there would be no negotiation. For him, the war was not just a territorial dispute, but an existential struggle. His speeches, delivered at the darkest hour, reinforced the idea of total resistance, even if Britain was left alone. From the German perspective, this stance was incomprehensible. Hitler had not gone to war with the United Kingdom due to a direct conflict. His primary objective had been to destroy the post-World War I order and expand German living space in Eastern Europe. In his ideological view, Great Britain was an imperial rival, but also a potential natural partner. He admired its empire, its maritime dominance, and its historical role as a global power. On more than one occasion, he stated that he did not wish to destroy the United Kingdom, but rather to force it to accept the new German hegemony on the continent. After the French surrender, Hitler expected London to sue for peace. From his perspective, the war was already decided. Germany controlled Western Europe, Italy had joined the conflict on the side of the Axis, and Britain, isolated, seemed condemned to a long and costly war that it could not win alone. In this context, Berlin sent ambiguous signals, vague speeches, diplomatic intermediaries, and statements that hinted at a possible negotiation if the British accepted the reality of the new European order. But those expectations clashed with reality. Far from seeking an agreement, the United Kingdom prepared to resist. Following the fall of France in June 1940, Germany found itself in an unprecedented position of power in continental Europe. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated its effectiveness in Blitzkrieg, crushing France and its allies in a matter of weeks. However, victory on land did not automatically translate into control of the Atlantic or the British Isles. The United Kingdom remained intact, protected by its island geography, its powerful navy, and the determination of its population and political leadership. The country entered a state of total war. Coastal defenses were reinforced, civilian and territorial militias were organized, and the production of aircraft, tanks, and anti-aircraft artillery was accelerated. The civilian population was trained to survive mass bombings and to assist in defense efforts. Each measure taken underscored that, far from being over, the war had entered a much more complex phase, where victory could not be achieved solely through the speed and surprise that had characterized the continental campaigns. At this point, the German High Command began to face a fundamental contradiction. Germany had demonstrated its land superiority, but lacked the naval means to effectively challenge the Royal Navy and guarantee a safe crossing of the English Channel. The Luftwaffe, though powerful, was not designed to single-handedly defeat an island nation with an effective air defense and the ability to maintain open supply lines by sea. This structural limitation forced a rethink of any invasion plan, highlighting the logistical difficulties inherent in an amphibious assault. Furthermore, the fall of France generated a dangerous sense of overconfidence among Nazi leaders. Many believed that Great Britain would soon surrender due to economic exhaustion, aerial bombardment, or internal demoralization. British resilience, the ability of its population to withstand the onslaught, and the future capacity to receive support from allies such as the United States were seriously underestimated. This overestimation of British vulnerability, coupled with the euphoria of the land victory, produced strategic confusion within the High Command. Thus, the period following the fall of France was a time of tension between arrogance and caution. Germany was at the height of its power but lacked a clear and effective plan to force the United Kingdom's surrender. The invasion of the islands was not a primary ideological objective for Hitler, but rather a choice forced upon him by Britain's refusal to accept defeat. Between the certainty of land power and the uncertainty of how to wage a prolonged naval and air war, one of the most consequential decisions of the entire Second World War began to take shape, determining whether Germany could truly invade Great Britain or whether it should seek another way to prolong and secure its dominance in Europe. Operation Sea Lion, the German plan to cross the canal. The so-called Operation Sea Lion was the code name for the German plan to invade the British Isles after the defeat of France in 1940. Although over time it has often been presented as an imminent threat, in reality it was a project plagued by doubts, improvisations, and contradictions from its inception. More than a solid and mature plan, Sea Lion reflected Germany's strategic limitations and, above all, the lack of a clear political decision on the part of its leadership. Following the French surrender, Adolf Hitler faced an unexpected dilemma. He had won the war in Western Europe with astonishing speed, but his main adversary remained. The United Kingdom not only refused to negotiate but also intensified its rhetoric of total resistance. Faced with this refusal, invasion began to be considered a possibility, although not an ideological priority. Hitler did not want a long war against the British. His preference remained to force a favorable peace without the need for a landing. On July 16, 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 16, which formally authorized preparations for the invasion of Great Britain. The document stated that the objective was to eliminate the United Kingdom as a base for continuing the war against Germany, but made it clear that the operation would only be carried out if a number of preconditions were met, particularly the neutralization of the British Air Force. From the beginning, Sea Lion was subordinate to factors that Germany did not fully control. The central problem was geographical and naval. Crossing the English Channel meant challenging the Royal Navy, the largest and most experienced fleet in the world. Germany lacked a navy capable of directly confronting it. The Kriegsmarine had suffered heavy losses in the Norwegian campaign and was not designed for a prolonged naval war against a global maritime power. Their large ships were few, vulnerable, and in many cases still incomplete. Faced with this weakness, the German plan relied on an improvised solution, the massive use of river barges adapted for troop transport. These vessels, originally designed for inland rivers and canals, were assembled in French and Belgian ports and hastily modified to cross the canal. They were slow, difficult to maneuver, and extremely vulnerable to bad weather and naval attacks. In practice, any decisive intervention by the Royal Navy would have turned the crossing into a catastrophe. From a military standpoint, Operation Sea Lion depended on perfect coordination between forces unaccustomed to working together. The Heer planned the initial landing of several divisions along the south coast of England, from Kent to Sussex. The idea was to establish beachheads, advance rapidly towards London, and force a British political collapse before the Royal Navy could react decisively. The plan's success rested on speed and chaos, the same elements that had worked in France. However, what had been an advantage on land became a weakness at sea. The German army lacked experience in large-scale amphibious operations. Unlike the Allies, who would later develop complex doctrines for amphibious landings, Germany was improvising without adequate resources, without naval superiority, and with limited knowledge of British coastal defences. In this context, the Luftwaffe acquired a decisive role. For the invasion to even be possible, the German Air Force had to destroy or neutralise the Royal Air Force, gain air supremacy over southern England, and protect both the landing beaches and the sea lanes. Without air control, the invasion fleet would be annihilated. Here, another structural problem arose. The Luftwaffe had been conceived as a support force for the ground army, not as an independent strategic instrument. Its bombers lacked the range and capability to sustainably strike deep industrial targets, and its doctrine was not geared toward destroying an enemy air force through a protracted campaign. Even so, it was assigned the most critical task of the entire operation. Tensions between the various German commanders further aggravated the situation. The head of the Kriegsmarine, Admiral Erich Raeder, repeatedly expressed his skepticism. For him, Operation Sea Lion was an extremely risky, almost suicidal operation if absolute air superiority and a significant reduction of British naval power were not achieved first. The army, on the other hand, was pressing to execute the landing as soon as possible, confident that a quick victory on land would solve the problem. Hitler, caught between these two positions, never fully resolved the contradiction. He authorized the preparations but repeatedly postponed the execution date. Each delay reflected his strategic indecisiveness. Sea Lion was not the ultimate goal of the war, but an inconvenient solution to a problem it hoped to avoid. Meanwhile, Great Britain was preparing intensively for its defense. The beaches were fortified, anti-tank obstacles were put in place, territorial defense forces were organized, and an immediate response to any landing was planned. The United Kingdom assumed that even if the Germans managed to cross the Channel, the decisive fighting would take place on British soil, where the invasion could be contained and worn down. Ultimately, Operation Sea Lion was less a plan for an actual invasion and more an instrument of political and psychological pressure. Hitler was confident that the threat, combined with bombing raids and economic attrition, would lead to British collapse without the need to risk a massively complex amphibious operation. When that hope faded, the plan was left suspended in a strategic limbo. Operation Sea Lion was never officially cancelled immediately, but it lost priority as other options began to attract Hitler's attention, especially the war against the Soviet Union. Thus, the project to cross the English Channel ended up becoming a symbol of what Germany could not do: defeat a maritime power without controlling the sea. This conceptual failure holds one of the fundamental keys to understanding why the invasion of Great Britain never took place: the strategic importance of air dominance. For Germany, air superiority was not a secondary objective, but the indispensable condition for any attempt to invade Great Britain to make sense. Without control of the skies, Operation Sea Lion was doomed to failure before it even began. This reality was understood by both the military command and Adolf Hitler, although not all agreed on how to achieve that goal or how long it would take to accomplish it. From a strategic perspective, air dominance meant much more than shooting down enemy aircraft. It meant denying the adversary the ability to observe, intercept, bomb, and, above all, intervene decisively on the battlefield. In the British case, it meant neutralizing the Royal Air Force, the only real barrier between the Luftwaffe and the German invasion fleet. If the RAF remained operational, any concentration of landing craft in French ports or any attempt to cross the English Channel would be detected and attacked immediately. The German logic was clear: if the RAF was destroyed or reduced to irrelevance, the Royal Navy would be exposed. Without air cover, even the most powerful fleet in the world would become vulnerable to attacks from the air. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters could harass British ships, forcing them to withdraw or at least to operate with extreme caution. In theory, the German-dominated skies would act as a shield for the fragile landing forces. However, this theory rested on a series of assumptions that did not entirely reflect reality. The Luftwaffe had been designed primarily as a tactical force, oriented towards supporting rapid ground advances. Their success in Poland, France, and the Netherlands had reinforced the belief that air power could decide entire campaigns in a matter of weeks. But those victories had come against enemies with inferior, disorganized, or poorly coordinated air forces. Britain presented a completely different challenge. Air superiority over the British Isles required a prolonged, systematic, and strategic campaign. Winning isolated engagements was not enough. It was necessary to destroy the very structure of the RAF. Airfields, command centers, aircraft factories, radar systems, and reserves of trained pilots. This implied a war of attrition that the Luftwaffe had neither doctrinally nor logistically planned for. Its medium bombers had a limited range, lacked adequate long-range escort, and were not designed for sustained deep-sea operations. One of the most decisive elements was the British defensive system. The United Kingdom had developed an integrated network of radars, ground observers, and control centers that allowed the RAF to react quickly and efficiently. This system not only detected enemy aircraft, but also optimized resource allocation, sending fighters only when and where they were needed. For Germany, this meant that every air raid faced a coordinated defense, not an improvised response. Furthermore, the battle for air superiority was not fought solely in technical or numerical terms, but also in human terms. The RAF was fighting over its own territory. British pilots shot down could return to combat within hours or days. German pilots captured or killed were a lost cause. As the campaign progressed, this asymmetry began to tip the scales. The Luftwaffe could produce aircraft, but it could not replace experienced crews as quickly. From the German perspective, air superiority had to be achieved quickly. Every passing week strengthened British defences and increased the risk of decisive naval intervention. The calendar became an invisible enemy. The inclement autumn weather, typical of the English Channel, reduced the possible windows for an amphibious invasion. Without air superiority before that period, a sea lion invasion became virtually impossible. Strategically, Hitler viewed air superiority not only as a military necessity, but also as a psychological tool. He believed that sustained bombing and constant pressure would break British morale, forcing the government to negotiate. In that view, destroying the RAF was not just a matter of operational security, but a step toward the political collapse of the enemy. This perception influenced subsequent decisions that shifted the Luftwaffe's focus toward urban and symbolic targets rather than concentrating exclusively on the enemy air force. The failure to achieve clear air superiority had immediate consequences. Without it, the Kriegsmarine refused to take the risk of protecting the Channel crossing. German reports themselves acknowledged that without complete air superiority, a massive Royal Navy intervention could destroy the invasion fleet in a matter of hours. Air superiority ceased to be an aspiration and became an insurmountable barrier. Ultimately, the strategic importance of air superiority lies in the fact that it exposed the limits of German power. It demonstrated that the swift victories of the early war could not be repeated indefinitely, and that a continental power faced enormous difficulties in defeating a well-prepared island nation. Germany's inability to destroy the RAF not only saved Britain from invasion, but marked a turning point in the war. For the first time, the Third Reich encountered an enemy it could not defeat through speed, terror, or surprise. Thus, the sky over England became the true decisive battleground. It wasn't the Channel, nor the beaches, nor even London. It was air superiority, never fully achieved, that sealed the fate of Operation Sea Lion and with it the German failure in their attempt to subdue Great Britain. The Battle of England and the failure of the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain represented the first major strategic confrontation in which Nazi Germany encountered not only unexpected resistance, but also a structural limit to its approach to warfare. After the fall of France, the Third Reich seemed invincible. Western Europe was defeated, and Great Britain stood alone against a military machine that had crushed all its adversaries in a matter of months. However, unlike previous campaigns, this time Germany could not advance with tanks or mechanized columns. The only path to victory lay through the air. The mission assigned to the Luftwaffe was clear on the surface: destroy the Royal Air Force, gain air supremacy over southern England, and pave the way for an amphibious invasion. But this initial clarity concealed deep doctrinal contradictions. The Luftwaffe had not been conceived as an independent strategic bombing force, but as a tactical instrument at the service of the army. Its previous experience was based on short, intense campaigns coordinated with ground forces. Great Britain demanded something radically different, a prolonged, attrition-based and precise air war. From the outset of the air offensive in the summer of 1940, the Germans underestimated their enemy. It was assumed that the RAF was on the verge of collapse following the French defeat, that it lacked sufficient pilots, and that its fighters were inferior. This misconception directly influenced their planning. The German commanders believed that a few weeks of intense attacks would be enough to break the British defences. They were not prepared for a long battle. The RAF, on the other hand, did not fight with aircraft alone, but with a complete system. Coastal radars, ground observers, control centres, and a highly efficient chain of command allowed them to detect, track, and counter each German incursion with surprising economy of means. British fighters didn't take off randomly or fight blindly. They were precisely directed to the exact point where they were needed. This allowed them to compensate for their numerical inferiority and reduce unnecessary attrition. One of the Luftwaffe's most serious mistakes was its inability to correctly identify the true centres of gravity of the British defensive system. Initially, attacks were concentrated on airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, which did put the RAF under enormous pressure. For several critical weeks, the British Air Force was operating near its limit. There was a shortage of trained pilots, aircraft were returning damaged, and bases were under repeated attack. However, just as that strategy was beginning to take effect, it was abandoned. The decision to shift the focus of the attacks towards London and other British cities marked a turning point. Motivated partly by retaliation, partly by political calculations, and partly by the belief that urban bombing would break civilian morale, this choice gave the RAF the respite it needed. The airfields ceased to be the primary target, the radar stations could be repaired, and the exhausted pilots had time to regroup. What had seemed like a decisive escalation turned into a missed opportunity. From an operational standpoint, the Luftwaffe also suffered from increasingly evident technical limitations. Its escort fighters lacked the range to accompany the bombers into the English interior and remain there for the necessary duration. This left the bombers vulnerable during the most critical moments of the mission. Each German loss was not just a shot-down aircraft, but experienced crews that could not be replaced quickly. The battle also had a crucial human dimension. British pilots were fighting over their own territory. If they were shot down, they could return to the fight. If they survived, they flew again. German pilots, on the other hand, were either taken prisoner or killed. As the weeks passed, this difference began to irreversibly shift the balance of power. The Luftwaffe could produce more aircraft, but it couldn't build experience at the same rate. In terms of leadership, internal tensions exacerbated the situation. Hermann Göring, in command of the Luftwaffe, made erratic decisions, downplayed negative reports, and blamed subordinates for failures. His initial confidence gave way to improvisation. The absence of a coherent and sustained strategy contrasted sharply with British defensive clarity. While Germany constantly shifted its objectives, the RAF maintained a single purpose: survival. The Luftwaffe's failure was neither immediate nor spectacular, but rather gradual and silent. There was no final great defeat, but an accumulation of errors, losses, and wrong decisions. Simply put, a point was reached where Germany had failed to achieve its primary objective, the destruction of the RAF. Without air supremacy, the invasion of Great Britain became unfeasible. The Battle of Britain did not end with a surrender, but with an inescapable reality. The skies remained in British hands. The consequences were profound and lasting. For the first time since the start of the war, the German advance was halted. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. Great Britain demonstrated that the Third Reich could be resisted and eventually defeated. The battle not only saved the islands from invasion, but also preserved a base from which, years later, the liberation of Western Europe would be launched. The Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain was not merely a military setback. It was a strategic defeat that altered the course of the war. It demonstrated that technical superiority and audacity are not enough without proper doctrine, an understanding of the enemy, and a coherent long-term strategy. In the skies over England, Germany lost more than just planes. It lost the initiative, the momentum, and the certainty that victory was inevitable. The planning of an amphibious invasion of Great Britain, known as Operation Sea Lion, faced logistical and technical challenges of a magnitude that few German leaders could fully comprehend in 1940. The idea of moving and landing hundreds of thousands of troops, vehicles, artillery and supplies across the English Channel was, in theory, possible. In practice, it constituted a colossal risk that required coordination, resources and capabilities that Germany simply did not possess at the time. One of the first obstacles was the canal's geography itself. Although its maximum width is only about 33 kilometers, the strait was not conducive to amphibious operations without absolute control of the airspace and sea. Tides, currents and changing weather conditions could seriously affect landing schedules. Each ship had to synchronize its arrival to the exact minute, and the dispersion of vessels meant that even small delays could turn into disasters. In terms of transport power, Germany lacked a sufficient amphibious fleet. The Kriegsmarine had not been built for mass landings, but for surface and submarine operations. The German Navy had some converted transports, fast boats, and adapted rivercraft, but its ability to move tens of thousands of troops along with their heavy equipment was extremely limited. Furthermore, the British naval forces, although weakened by the war in Europe, still posed a considerable threat. Destroyers, cruisers, and submarines could intercept or sink entire convoys before they reached the coast. Another critical factor was logistical supply. A landing of this magnitude required meticulous planning of provisions, food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, and spare parts. Every delay or loss of cargo could paralyze the initial advance of the troops on land, condemning the first contingents to disorganization and vulnerability to counterattacks. The Luftwaffe was supposed to guarantee continuous air protection over the convoys and landing beaches, but reality proved that maintaining constant air superiority over a large amphibious operation was almost impossible. Each loss of fighters or bombers left the transported units exposed to coastal artillery and attacks by the Royal Navy. Coordination between the different branches of the military presented another monumental challenge. The Wehrmacht had accumulated experience in rapid land operations in Blitzkrieg, but amphibious operations required perfect synchronization between the Navy, Air Force, and Army. Every communication error, every delay in signaling or execution could turn into a disaster, and German planning relied too heavily on optimistic assumptions about the effectiveness of its air forces and British passivity. Furthermore, British resistance on the coast could not be underestimated. Coastal defenses included fortifications, mines, beach barriers, and artillery poised to repel mass landings. The Allies' experience in the First World War and the constant vigilance of intelligence services meant that the Germans could not completely surprise the enemy. Every landing attempt would be met with concentrated fire, with devastating consequences for the initial units and a high risk of a stalemate that the Luftwaffe could not counter. Finally, climatic factors were a silent but relentless enemy. Storms in the Channel could delay landings, cause small boats to sink and scatter formations. Coastal currents could drag ships out of their intended area, disrupting the entire operation. Unlike other rapid land campaigns, the sea added a layer of uncertainty that could not be controlled by tactical superiority or military audacity. Taken together, these logistical and technical limitations made Operation Sea Lion not only risky, but practically unfeasible without complete air and naval supremacy, something the Luftwaffe could not guarantee and the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. The combination of these limitations with Germany's failure to destroy the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain effectively doomed any attempt at invasion. The challenge was not only to defeat the British on land, but to overcome a series of material, climatic, and operational obstacles that made crossing the Channel an extremely vulnerable and potentially catastrophic act. In short, German planning clashed head-on with reality. A military apparatus prepared for Blitzkrieg was not designed for complex amphibious operations, and the lack of preparation, along with British resilience, transformed the idea of invading Great Britain from a strategic ambition into an unacceptable risk. The combination of technical, logistical, and strategic limitations sealed the fate of Operation Sea Lion before it could even begin. Adolf Hitler's doubts and strategic decisions. Following the failure of German forces to achieve air supremacy during the Battle of Britain and the evident logistical limitations of Operation Sea Lion, Adolf Hitler found himself at a strategic crossroads of enormous complexity. His decisions could no longer be based solely on the tactical audacity that had characterized the Blitzkrieg in France and Poland. Now he had to weigh large-scale strategic risks with political, military, and moral implications that would affect not only the immediate course of the war, but the very survival of the Third Reich. Hitler understood that the invasion of Great Britain required absolute control of the English Channel, its communication routes, and, above all, its airspace. Without the Luftwaffe completely dominating British skies, any attempt to cross would turn into a bloodbath for the landing troops. Reports received from the air front showed that, despite the intensity of the attacks on military and civilian targets in England, the RAF was not completely defeated. Their pilots, trained, motivated, and increasingly experienced, could respond effectively to German attacks, and with each passing day, the bombers' fatigue and the risk of irreparable losses increased. In private, Hitler debated with himself the possibility of postponing the invasion or even discarding it, but his psychology and ideological vision profoundly influenced these considerations. On the one hand, the idea of invading Great Britain was consistent with their objective of eliminating a persistent enemy that refused to capitulate after the fall of France. On the other hand, empirical evidence coming from the Channel and the air front showed that any landing could turn into an instant disaster. Their generals, including figures like Keitel and Jodl, presented cold, calculated technical estimates that warned of almost certain failure if they advanced without securing air and naval supremacy. As he assessed the situation, Hitler also considered political factors. The occupation of Great Britain would have involved enormous human and logistical resources that could weaken German control over the conquered territories in France and the Netherlands. The Führer knew that if he attempted the invasion and failed, he would not only lose men and equipment, but also political legitimacy and credibility among his allies, which could open the door to internal tensions within the Nazi Party and the military high command. Furthermore, Hitler considered the implications of a protracted conflict in the Channel. Unlike the swift, lightning-fast land campaigns, an attempted invasion of Britain would transform the war into a sustained conflict, with continuous landings, resupply, and operations that the Kriegsmarine was ill-prepared to sustain. Each day of delay could allow the British to reinforce their coastal defences and improve their radar and artillery systems, increasing the risk of failure. Hitler's psychology at this time also played a decisive role. His authoritarian character, his tendency to overestimate audacity and underestimate enemy resistance, were now confronted by the objective evidence of the situation. Internal doubts manifested themselves in frequent changes of guidelines, consultations with subordinates, revisions of plans, and a constant debate about the balance between risk and reward. However, the accumulation of information about the effectiveness of the RAF and the logistical limitations of a channel crossing began to tip the balance towards caution, although never without Hitler expressing his usual drama and desires for strategic grandeur. Ultimately, the decision to postpone and eventually abandon Operation Sea Lion was the culmination of an analysis process that considered strategic, logistical, and psychological factors. Hitler understood that a failed invasion would not only involve the loss of lives and resources, but would also expose Germany to a counterattack that could change the course of the war. The combination of British resistance, the persistent ineffectiveness of the insufficient Luftwaffe, the technical challenges of an amphibious operation, and the internal and external political implications led the Führer to abandon the ambition of invading Great Britain, concentrating his efforts on other fronts and marking a turning point in World War II. This decision, although pragmatic, was not without internal tensions and debates among the commanders, and reflects how Hitler, for the first time since the beginning of the war, had to face the reality of the limits of his power, his army, and his ideology in the face of the tenacious resistance of a determined enemy. It was a moment when ambition clashed with reality and the need for strategic survival prevailed over impulses of personal conquest. The shift in priorities from Great Britain to the Soviet Union. After abandoning the idea of invading Great Britain, the German High Command, and Adolf Hitler in particular, were forced to completely redefine the strategic priorities of the war. The impossibility of subduing England through an amphibious invasion not only represented a tactical failure, but also had a domino effect on all of Germany's military and logistical planning. The Reich, which had focused large amounts of human material and technological resources on the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, now had to reallocate those assets to other fronts, mainly towards the east, where the Soviet Union represented the most significant threat and the most central ideological objective of Nazi expansionism. From a military perspective, this redefinition meant mobilizing entire armies for a far more complex and demanding continental warfare scenario. Divisions trained for amphibious landings and rapid operations against island territories now had to adapt to prolonged combat across vast terrain, with harsh winters and extremely long supply lines. The Wehrmacht, which until then had relied on the speed and surprise of its Blitzkriegs in Western Europe, now faced the need to sustain large-scale attrition operations against a numerous, ideologically motivated enemy capable of recovering quickly from losses. The change in approach also had profound ideological implications. Hitler had conceived of the war against the USSR from the outset as a racial and existential crusade. It was not merely a matter of territorial expansion, but of implementing the vision of Lebensraum, the conquest of the East as living space for the German people, and the eradication of what he considered the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. With British resistance intact, any hope of negotiating a surrender or achieving England's internal collapse vanished. This reinforced Hitler's conviction that true victory could not be achieved without the destruction of the Soviet Union, which he saw as the final barrier to German hegemony in Europe. The strategic priority was not only military but also ideological. The annihilation of Soviet power became the absolute center of Nazi war thinking. This shift in priorities critically impacted German war logistics and production. Equipment intended for the invasion of England, including transport ships, landing craft, coastal artillery, and aircraft prepared for strategic airstrikes, was redistributed or reconfigured to serve the Eastern Campaign. The Luftwaffe, which had been focused on maintaining air superiority over the English Channel and bombing British cities, had to adjust its strategies to provide direct cover for ground offensives on Soviet territories, where air control would be crucial to breaking through defensive lines and supporting armored divisions in rapid movements. The strategic rethink also included an adjustment to personnel policy and officer training. Generals, chiefs of staff, and logistics experts who had been assigned to plan the invasion of Great Britain were reassigned to planning duties on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's intelligence and planning services had to quickly learn to assess Soviet mobilization capacity, the extent of their human and material resources, as well as the geographical characteristics of a vast and diverse territory that included forests, extensive rivers, and open plains, all of which favored the defense in depth that the Soviets would implement. The economic and logistical impact was also profound. The German war economy, already strained by the occupation of territories in Western Europe, had to adapt to supply an Eastern Front that demanded massive quantities of fuel, ammunition, spare parts for armored vehicles, and food for millions of soldiers. The arms industry, from the production of panzer tanks to the manufacture of heavy artillery, had to reorganize its priorities, delaying other projects, including technological improvements that had been planned for the war against England, such as modifications of attack aircraft and submarines to support the amphibious invasion. The abandonment of Great Britain also had indirect strategic consequences. By not eliminating the United Kingdom, Germany allowed it to remain a secure base for coordinating Allied operations, including providing material aid to the Soviet Union via convoys and preparing for future offensives on other fronts. This made Britain a key pillar of the Allied resistance, whose continued presence would force Germany to maintain considerable forces in the West to prevent any Allied landings, further limiting the ability to concentrate troops in the East. Ultimately, the abandonment of the invasion of Great Britain marked a strategic turning point for Germany. What could have been an operation that, if successful, might have forced British surrender and eliminated a direct threat, became the necessity of simultaneously confronting two rapidly expanding fronts. The initial mistake, which stemmed from the inability to achieve air superiority and the impossible logistics of the amphibious operation, triggered a chain of decisions that compromised the Third Reich's ability to sustain its expansion. Redistributing resources to the east not only involved new military planning, but also the acceptance of a prolonged conflict where Soviet resistance and the maintenance of an active Western front would become decisive factors that, over time, would define the final defeat of Germany. In this context, the change of approach by Hitler and the High Command was not simply a tactical adaptation, it was a profound transformation of German war strategy, reflecting the combination of material limitations, ideological considerations, and the need to ensure the regime's survival in the short term, even though in the long term this decision would sow the seeds of total failure. Hitler's decision to shift the strategic focus from west to east was not simply a geographical relocation of resources and war efforts, but a comprehensive rethinking involving temporal, logistical, diplomatic, and propaganda factors, with profound military and political implications. The invasion of the East, later known as Operation Barbarossa, required an extremely complex and coordinated deployment, which had to take advantage of the relatively short window of the summer months, when roads and rivers were more passable and the weather allowed the movement of troops, armored vehicles, and supplies. Unlike the crossing of the English Channel, an operation limited in time and space, the campaign in the Soviet Union involved movements that would extend for hundreds of kilometers, with supply lines stretched to the maximum of the Reich's logistical capacity, exposing the army to possible disruptions and disorganization. Each unit had to be fed, equipped, and coordinated meticulously. Any delay or failure could have catastrophic consequences, something Hitler repeatedly underestimated in his confidence in the Wehrmacht and German superiority. The strategic context also demanded a rethinking of alliances and diplomacy. Countries that had previously maintained neutral or ambiguous positions acquired a crucial role in planning the offensive to the east. Spain, under Franco, offered a strategic position for intelligence and, potentially, for operations in the Mediterranean. Turkey controlled vital routes to the Caucasus and the Middle East. Finland became an ally of convenience to harass the Soviet army from the north, participating in the conflict against the Soviet Union during the Continuation War. Securing the tacit or explicit cooperation of these countries was no small matter. It directly affected the German ability to concentrate forces and guarantee secure flanks as it advanced into the interior of Soviet territory. Pressure on Britain, although no longer directly linked to an amphibious landing, remained significant. London remained an Allied stronghold and a centre of strategic operations that could threaten German supply lines in northern France, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. Therefore, the Luftwaffe had to continue strategic bombing operations and maintain the ability to intimidate the British population and its industrial infrastructure in order to force the United Kingdom to maintain resources and military attention in defence, limiting its ability to intervene on other fronts. The propaganda and psychological dimension of this strategic shift was also decisive. Hitler, aware that the morale of the party and the army could falter after the failure of the Channel Campaign and British resistance, presented the offensive against the Soviet Union as the definitive conflict in European history. The struggle transformed into a narrative of existential confrontation between European civilization, represented by Germany, and the communist and Jewish threat from Moscow, which Hitler constructed as the embodiment of absolute evil. This narrative not only served to maintain the internal cohesion of the Nazi Party and the armed forces, but also to justify the massive mobilization of men and resources, from millions of soldiers to entire industries, including heavy weaponry, rail transport, fuel, and medical supplies. The propaganda emphasized that victory in the East would ensure the survival of the German nation and the implementation of its ideological vision, thus maintaining the illusion of inevitability and the legitimacy of Hitler's leadership, even when operational reality showed concrete limitations in logistics, distance, and enemy resistance. The shift in priorities also entailed an internal restructuring of the command structures. Commanders experienced in rapid operations in Western Europe had to adapt to the war of attrition in the East, a conflict that demanded patience, improvisation, and resilience in the face of extreme conditions. Strategic planning and intelligence groups were reorganized, incorporating experts in Soviet geography, climatology, and the mobility of large armies, while analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the Red Army. Every decision, from the location of supply depots to the scheduling of offensives, had to consider the extent of the territory, logistical distances, and the possibility of enemy attacks on exposed flanks. Ultimately, this strategic reassessment highlighted the complexity and risks of German expansionism. The impossibility of invading Great Britain not only meant the failure of a tactical objective, but also forced Hitler to commit his entire military and economic apparatus to a front whose scale and difficulty would surpass any previous operation. Ultimately, this strategic reassessment highlighted the complexity and risks of German expansionism. The impossibility of invading Great Britain not only meant the failure of a tactical objective, but also forced Hitler to commit his entire military and economic apparatus to a front whose scale and difficulty would surpass any previous operation. The combination of seasonal, logistical, diplomatic, and psychological factors transformed the war into a conflict of monumental proportions, where meticulous planning and constant adaptation would be decisive, and where any mistake could have irreversible consequences, something that, in the course of the Eastern Campaign, would be demonstrated with dramatic clarity. The decision to focus all attention on the Soviet Union marked not only a change in priorities, but the beginning of a path that, although ideologically conceived as a decisive victory, would become one of the most significant strategic errors of the Second World War. The strategic shift eastward after abandoning the invasion of Great Britain represented, in military terms, an unprecedented challenge for the Wehrmacht. It not only involved deploying troops across a vast territory, stretching hundreds of kilometers and encompassing rivers, forests, swamps, and mountainous regions, but also confronting extreme climates, from sweltering summers to winters that could paralyze movement and machinery. Logistics became the critical factor. Every tank, every truck, every howitzer, and every food ration depended on supply lines stretched to the limit of what was possible, while the Soviet infrastructure, although less developed than the German one, presented additional challenges in terms of transport and storage. The lessons learned during the French campaign, where speed and coordination had been key, and the British resistance, which showed the importance of air control and organized defense, warned that an enemy that initially seemed vulnerable could recover quickly and generate a devastating counterattack. However, Hitler placed his full trust in German tactical superiority, the effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg, and strategic surprise, underestimating the Soviet Union's ability to reorganize and mobilize massive human resources. The concentration of efforts eastward also had profound economic and industrial implications. The German war machine had to be reoriented to produce not only more weapons and combat vehicles, but also specialized equipment for dealing with difficult terrain and extreme climates. This included the manufacture of vehicles with better traction, uniforms suitable for low temperatures, and ammunition capable of operating in adverse conditions. Logistical planning could not be limited to storing supplies at the starting points. Intermediate depots, secure rail transport, and coordination between engineering and transport units were required to ensure that the advancing forces were not isolated. Every delay could be fatal, and the length of the communication lines made the units vulnerable to attacks by local guerrillas or ambushes by Soviet mobile units. From a strategic point of view, the abandonment of Great Britain entailed a complete readjustment of the Third Reich's political and military objectives. British resistance, although no longer posing an immediate threat of invasion, remained a significant obstacle in terms of diplomacy, trade, and economic warfare. England continued to control vital sea routes, facilitating supplies to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease and maintaining Allied morale. Therefore, while Germany concentrated its resources in the east, the Luftwaffe had to maintain strategic bombing operations, attacks against ports and industrial centers, and the ability to intimidate the British population, with the aim of forcing London to maintain resources in defense and limiting its influence on other fronts. In parallel, the ideological dimension of the shift in priorities acquired a central role in Nazi propaganda. Hitler presented the war against the Soviet Union as the decisive confrontation in European history, a struggle between Western civilization, embodied in Germany, and Judeo-Bolshevik communism, which he perceived as the ultimate existential threat. This discourse made it possible to justify the mass mobilization of soldiers, the exploitation of the economy for war, and the acceptance of massive human casualties, including the conscription of young people and veterans. Keeping this internal narrative alive was crucial to sustaining morale, given that the failure of the Blitzkrieg in the English Channel had shown that even German strength was not invincible. However, this strategic reorientation also came at a high cost in terms of military planning. The Wehrmacht had to adapt to a completely different type of warfare. Instead of quick, localized operations, it would face a protracted conflict with large-scale fighting, the occupation of vast territories, and constant resistance from an enemy capable of regrouping. The commanders, accustomed to rapid maneuvers in Western Europe, were forced to plan campaigns that required months of coordination, intelligence on geography and climate, and the ability to improvise in the face of Soviet resilience. The complexity of these operations far exceeded any previous challenges of the early war, and the pressure on Hitler and his general staff increased day by day. Ultimately, abandoning the invasion plan of Great Britain not only meant a change in a military objective, but also opened a path towards strategic decisions of enormous risk. Concentrating forces in the east exposed the Third Reich to the dangers of excessively long supply lines, underestimating the enemy's capabilities and the inability to sustain prolonged offensives. Every logistical error, every delay, or every failure in coordination could turn into a catastrophe, and in fact would. The choice to prioritize the Soviet Union over Great Britain largely determined the course of World War II. Germany would not only lose the war in the east, but would irreversibly compromise its resources, leaving the Reich vulnerable to an Allied coalition that exploited every weakness. The decision to abandon the canal crossing and turn attention to the east marked a strategic turning point with consequences that would resonate until the final defeat of the Third Reich in 1945. Consequences of abandoning the invasion. The definitive abandonment of the invasion plan of Great Britain, known as Operation Sea Lion, had profound and far-reaching consequences, which manifested themselves on the military, political, strategic, and ideological levels for the Third Reich, and for the course of the Second World War as a whole. The decision to postpone and ultimately cancel the invasion marked a critical turning point, with implications that would resonate for years. First, the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain irreversibly demonstrated that Germany could not guarantee control of the airspace over the English Channel, an indispensable requirement for any amphibious crossing. The inability to subdue the British Royal Air Force meant that the Wehrmacht would face extreme risks in attempting to transport troops, tanks, and supplies across a sea dominated by enemy forces. This technical and military realization forced a complete rethinking of the Führer's strategy and that of his generals. Nazi Germany missed the opportunity to end the war in its initial phase by delivering a decisive blow against Great Britain, which instead consolidated itself as a bastion of resistance, a base of operations for future Allied landings, and a symbol of resilience against Nazi tyranny. The inability to invade the United Kingdom also had a significant psychological impact. Until that point, Hitler and his high command had operated under the conviction that Blitzkrieg could guarantee swift and crushing victories. British resistance introduced the first visible crack in the illusion of German invincibility. Both the civilian population and the military began to realize that the war would not be short or decisive on the Western Front. This perception partially eroded troop morale and complicated the regime's propaganda, which had presented the war as a series of inevitable conquests. From a strategic point of view, the cancellation of the invasion forced Germany to redistribute resources to other fronts. Amphibious and elite units, trained for the assault on England, were reassigned to the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean, especially for operations against Yugoslavia, Greece, and eventually the Soviet Union. This redistribution had direct consequences for logistical preparation, as limited resources had to cover larger and more complex theaters of operations while maintaining pressure on Great Britain through strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe, for example, went from a role of direct support for the invasion to a massive program of attacks on British cities, known as the Blitz, with the aim of undermining civilian morale, but without achieving the expected surrender. Politically, the failure reinforced the perception that Britain could not be easily neutralized. This had significant diplomatic effects. Hitler ruled out the possibility of a negotiated peace, and British resistance consolidated the alliance with the United States, whose post-war entry would make the United Kingdom the operational and logistical core of the Allied coalition. Britain's continued existence as a secure stronghold allowed Churchill to maintain his country's morale and project strength into the occupied territories, stimulating resistance movements and keeping open strategic corridors that would prove crucial in the following years. On a military level, the abandonment of Operation Sea Lion forced Germany to concentrate on the eastern offensive, a shift that would have fatal consequences. The decision to prioritize the invasion of the Soviet Union over the conquest of Great Britain meant excessively extending supply lines and facing extreme weather conditions while underestimating the Red Army's capacity for mass mobilization. This redistribution of forces and resources, driven by the inability to subdue Great Britain, placed Germany in an extremely vulnerable strategic position. While it eliminated the immediate threat of a channel crossing, it created a new scenario of large-scale confrontation where logistical difficulties and Soviet resistance would jeopardize the very survival of the Third Reich. The defeat also had a lasting effect on the international perception of the war. Up to that point, Nazi Germany had amassed swift and crushing victories in continental Europe. British resistance, however small in territorial terms, demonstrated that the Reich could be stopped and that German supremacy was not absolute. This had a catalytic effect on future Allied coalitions, reinforcing the idea that a united front could eventually defeat Hitler. In conclusion, the abandonment of the invasion of Great Britain was not simply an operational delay or a tactical change. It was a strategic milestone that transformed the war. It determined the shift to the east, redefined the allocation of resources and military personnel, altered the international perception of the conflict, and revealed the limits of Nazi expansion. The consequences were multiple and profound. Militarily, Germany lost the opportunity for a decisive blow. Psychologically, the image of invincibility was eroded. Strategically, an eastern front was opened that would prove unsustainable, and politically, it strengthened the position of the Allies. This abandonment silently but irreversibly marked the beginning of the decline that would culminate in the final defeat of the Third Reich. The definitive abandonment of the invasion plan of Great Britain is undoubtedly one of the most significant strategic errors of the Third Reich during the Second World War. This decision, although partly forced by external circumstances, had implications that resonated throughout the conflict and that, silently but decisively, changed the course of the war in Europe. Analyzing it requires understanding not only the immediate factors, such as the Luftwaffe's air defeat, but also the medium and long-term consequences that impacted Germany's military, political, and logistical capabilities. From a military point of view, the inability to subdue the Royal Air Force and secure dominance of British skies meant that any attempt at an amphibious invasion would be extraordinarily risky. Operation Sea Lion, planned to transport tens of thousands of troops, tanks, artillery and supplies across the English Channel, was entirely dependent on air control. Without it, the Wehrmacht would have been exposed to devastating attacks from the sea and from the air, with incalculable human and material losses. This failure highlighted the first major structural limitation of the Nazi military apparatus: the excessive dependence on air superiority to guarantee complex combined operations. The strategic error of failing to invade also had profound political repercussions. British resistance, symbolized by Churchill and the resilience of the civilian population, consolidated a united front that would remain operational throughout the war. Great Britain not only became a safe haven for the planning and execution of future operations, but also the logistical hub from which the campaigns against North Africa, Italy, and eventually the Normandy landings would be launched. Hitler, failing to neutralize the United Kingdom, allowed this country to become an Allied coordination center that would sustain the global resistance against the Reich. From a broader strategic perspective, abandoning the invasion involved a change of priorities that proved decisive. Attention and military resources shifted eastward, particularly toward the Soviet Union. The planning of Operation Barbarossa, which was already underway, now received additional resources from units and personnel originally intended for the invasion of Great Britain. This opened a gigantic front in extreme weather conditions with long supply lines and a massive organized enemy capable of recovering. The mistake then was not only tactical but strategic. By forgoing a direct attack on a weakened and confident adversary, Germany faced a conflict of attrition against an emerging power with virtually unlimited human and territorial resources. Furthermore, the abandonment of the invasion had psychological effects both inside and outside Germany. For the Nazi population and leadership, the British resistance demonstrated that the idea of swift and decisive victories was illusory. The perception of invincibility, which had characterized the early years of the war, began to erode, affecting troop morale and the confidence of international partners. For the Allies, however, British resistance became a symbol of hope and an incentive for the formation of stronger coalitions. The war, until then seen as a series of inevitable German conquests, was beginning to show signs that it could be contained and reversed. The era also manifested itself in terms of logistics and military preparedness. Specialized amphibious units, engineers, and heavy artillery that had been trained and equipped for the crossing of the canal were diverted to other, less decisive fronts, or misused in campaigns that did not significantly alter the overall trajectory of the conflict. The Luftwaffe, for its part, exhausted resources in the strategic bombing campaign over Great Britain known as the Blitz, without achieving sufficient destruction of infrastructure or civilian morale to force a surrender. The combination of these decisions reflected a comprehensive miscalculation. The war was dragging on, the pressure on Germany was increasing, and resources were being dispersed without a decisive objective. Ultimately, the abandonment of the invasion of Great Britain symbolizes a failure of strategic vision. Hitler and his high command failed to anticipate the long-term consequences of maintaining Great Britain as an active and operational enemy. This mistake directly contributed to the opening of a more demanding Eastern Front, the strengthening of the Anglo-American alliance, and the prolongation of the war in a global scenario that eventually became unsustainable for the Third Reich. Historical analysis of this era demonstrates that it was not simply a tactical defeat or a momentary obstacle. It was a strategic failure that defined the course of the war, limited Germany's options, and allowed the Allies to consolidate their position. In simple terms, abandoning the invasion of Great Britain meant giving up a unique opportunity to eliminate a weakened adversary, committing critical resources on multiple fronts, and underestimating the resilience and recovery capacity of the Allies. This mistake, silent at the time, became a turning point that forever changed the course of the conflict and, ultimately, the history of the 20th century.